The European dream is not fading anymore. It is finished, completely over, and this time I am not speaking in metaphors. I am talking about cold, hard mathematics, about numbers that do not lie, about equations that cannot be argued with. Europe has crossed a point where its economic collapse is no longer about bad policy or weak leadership. It has become mathematically unavoidable. Let me be very clear. This is not exaggeration. This is not drama. This is reality. The core equations that run Europe's economy have reached a stage where every policy response makes the crisis worse. No matter what leaders do, the result is the same. No matter what leaders do, the result is the same. Europe is stuck in a doom loop, a vicious cycle with no escape inside the current system. So how do we get here? What actually happened to Europe, to understand why collapse is now locked into the math? We must look at the numbers as the year 2025 comes to an end. Germany, once called the engine of Europe, is barely moving. Growth this year is projected at 0.2%, not 2%, 0.2. That is not growth. That is stagnation pretending to be alive. Yeah. France is not far behind. Its economy is expected to grow by 0.7%. And even that may be generous. The Eurozone as a whole is expected to grow by just 0.9%, Now compare that to the United States, which is growing at around 2.5%. The gap is no longer small. It is a chasm opening beneath Europe. Okay. But weak growth is only the surface problem. The real danger is debt. Government debt across the European Union now stands above 80% of gross domestic product, and it keeps rising. It is projected to reach 82% this year, 83.8% in 2026, and 84.5% in 2027. A slow and relentless climb. But here is where the mathematics becomes truly frightening. That is only government debt. Private and corporate debt are added. Total debt across the European Union reached nearly 690% of gross domestic product in 2024. That is almost 7 times the size of the entire economy, 7 times. At this point, some will say, we have had high debt before. We survived the sovereign debt crisis. We will manage again. Belief that is wrong, completely wrong. And in the next part, I will explain why this time is fundamentally different, what makes this crisis different and mathematically impossible to solve under the current system is demographics. Europe is aging faster than almost any place on earth except Japan. Every year, the number of working age people goes down. Every year, the number of retirees goes up. This changes everything. Debt keeps increasing, but the number of people expected to carry that debt keeps shrinking. The top of the equation grows, the bottom of the equation collapses. Researchers who studied the impact of aging on public finances reached a disturbing conclusion. When future obligations like pensions, healthcare, and long-term care are added to existing public debt, the real public debt burden of the European Union rises to 349% of gross domestic product. The differences between countries are extreme. Lithuania stands at around 59%. Ireland reaches an almost unbelievable 1,267%. These are not theoretical numbers. These are promises already made, and they will have to be paid. This is not a crisis that can be inflated away. It is not a crisis Europe can grow out of. The mathematics does not allow it. There are fewer workers, there are more retirees. Healthcare and pension costs keep rising, and the debt mountain grows larger every single day. So how has Europe responded? By using the same old playbook that created this crisis in the first place. Austerity for ordinary people, keep money for the system. As inflation finally falls below target, the European Central Bank cuts interest rates to 2%, down from 4% just 2 years ago. They call it stimulus. In reality, it is desperation, and this is where the doom loop tightens. Okay. Lower interest rates are supposed to boost investment and growth, but in Europe, they are not working. Not because money is unavailable, but because Europe suffers from a deep structural competitiveness crisis, one that monetary policy cannot fix. Even the Draghi report commissioned by the European Commission admits this. Europe is not falling behind because it lacks talent or capital. It is falling behind because its systems cannot deliver at scale or speed. Energy costs remain higher than in the United States and China. Capital markets are fragmented. European companies cannot scale. Critical skills are missing as demographics collapse. Education systems are not keeping up. Regulations are so heavy that 2/3 of European companies say they block growth. So the central bank cuts rates, but businesses do not invest. Growth remains weak. Tax revenues stagnate. Budget deficits widen. France alone is projected to run a deficit of 5.5% of gross domestic product. Debt keeps piling up. Fewer workers remain to service it. So rates are cut again and again. Nothing changes. This is the mathematical trap. Every policy response makes the crisis worse. And let me tell you what always follows this combination: economic stagnation, rising debt, political paralysis, and falling living standards. History is very clear about what comes next. Extremism, social fragmentation, and the return of dangerous ideologies. We are already seeing it across Europe. Political instability in Germany, government breakdown in France, and the rapid rise of far-right movements across the continent. This is not coincidence. It is consequence. It is the predictable outcome of prolonged economic failure, right? To its credit, the European Commission now seems to understand how serious this crisis has become. In January 2025, it released what it called a competitiveness compass, based largely on the recommendations of the Draghi report. The language sounds promising: closing the innovation gap with the United States and China, strengthening economic security, execrating decarbonization, innovation. All the right words are there, but here is the real problem. The solutions being proposed require coordination between 27 member states, each with its own political limits, each with its own elections, each with its own nationalist pressures. Even the Commission admits this risk. One European diplomat reviewing the plan said, "The biggest danger is that we have correctly diagnosed the problem, but fail to move fast enough to solve it." And that is fatal, because in a world where the United States and China can roll out industrial policy in months, Europe moves at a crawl, like a layer upon layer of governance, endless negotiation, endless compromise. Europe does not have years. It does not even have months. The mathematics is already catching up. Germany and France, the two largest economies in Europe, are already under severe strain. They entered the year 2025 without approved budgets, political paralysis, fiscal drift, right? Goldman Sachs warns that Europe faces a very difficult year ahead, citing high energy prices, a slowing China, political uncertainty, and rising trade tensions. But 2025 is not the crisis. It is the beginning of a difficult decade. As growth remains weak and debt keeps rising, European governments will soon face an impossible choice. Okay. Cut spending on healthcare and pensions for rapidly aging populations, or allow deficits to explode even further. Both paths lead to social unrest. Both paths undermine political stability. Both paths strengthen extremist movements. This is the brutal arithmetic Europe now faces, with fewer workers supporting more retirees. The only way to maintain current benefits is to massively raise taxes or dramatically increase productivity, But productivity cannot rise fast enough because of the structural barriers already described, and taxes cannot rise high enough without triggering capital flight, job losses, and deeper economic contraction. So Europe will do what it always does. It will muddle through, it will implement half measures, it will issue more debt, and it will hope for a miracle, and as it does, the doom loop tightens. Here is what the mathematics tells us will happen next, right? Within the next decade, several European countries will face sovereign debt crises, warble Europetekris to phobries, crises that will make Greece look manageable by comparison. Europe failed to reform after previous emergencies, and that failure has left the euro deeply vulnerable, right? When the next crisis arrives, and it will arrive, the European Central Bank will already be cornered. Interest rates will already be low. Central bank balance sheets will already be bloated, and the political appetite for solidarity will have faded. At that moment, the mathematics will present Europe with a brutal choice. Either the European Union fundamentally restructures its economic and political architecture, or it begins to disintegrate. There is no middle path. The equations do not allow one. Some will object. They will say this is too pessimistic. They will say every generation believes it is living through the end. And yes, every generation faces challenges, but not every generation faces this combination at the same time. Demographic collapse, unsustainable debt, structural economic decline, and political fragmentation. This convergence is historically unprecedented. A European Commission official involved in the competitiveness strategy said, "We are moving from firefighting to future-proofing." But that is not what is happening. Europe is still firefighting. It is simply using more sophisticated language to describe it. Now, non-alphabal for force to describe. Through future-proofing would mean admitting that the Eurozone in its current form is mathematically unstable. It would mean creating a real fiscal union to match the monetary union. It would mean European-level debt instruments to share risk. Fair amalische offer skal to raise RSP, productivity, infrastructure. It would mean European-level debt instruments to share risk. It would mean massive investment to raise productivity, infrastructure, technology, energy. It would mean redesigning pension and healthcare systems based on demographic reality, not demographic fantasy. It would mean confronting powerful corporate and financial interests that benefit from the current broken system. But none of this is being done. Instead, Europe produces reports, holds summits, issues statements, and congratulates itself for acknowledging the problem. Meanwhile, the mathematics moves forward, indifferent to speeches, indifferent to intentions. So what must Europe do now facing mathematical reality? First, we must tell the truth. We must stop pretending that small fixes and slow reforms will be enough. The European project, as it is now, is not working. The numbers show it, the math confirms it. Ignoring it is not a solution. Second, we must change how Europe manages its economy. Not in 5 years, not in 10 years. Now, we need a real fiscal union. We need Europe-wide investment on a scale that matches the challenge. We must share resources and risks, or every country will face problems on its own. Third, we must deal with the competitiveness problems directly. Invest heavily in clean energy to lower costs, remove rules that stop innovation, build a real single market for money, workers, and services, train the workforce for the economy of the future. Fourth, we must adjust social policies for an aging population. This will be a hard conversation, but it cannot be avoided. Retirement ages should match life expectancy. Healthcare should focus on prevention. Immigration policies should reflect the need for working people. These topics are sensitive, but math does not care about politics. Fifth, we must do all of this while keeping democracy and society strong. This is the biggest challenge. Big changes are needed, and big changes can create risks if not handled carefully. The math is clear. The rules are strict. Europe's current economic path is not sustainable. But math cannot tell us everything. It cannot say we have to accept the current system. It cannot say change is impossible. It cannot say we have to watch problems grow. The system can be changed. The rules can be rewritten. But only if we act fast and on a large scale. Only if we stop using old tools for new problems, Only if we choose to build a stronger Europe instead of letting the current one fail. The numbers are clear. The math is certain, but how we respond is still our choice. The question is, do we have the courage to act